So delighted to be here today with Ben Breier. Ben, welcome.
Thanks,
You've been,
Jeff. Good to see you.
you've been recognized over and over as one of the top CEOs in healthcare. Hell, probably one of the best CEOs in any industry. You're a great leader, and you're a great leader in a world that's screaming for more leaders. And one of the qualities you think is really important is, and I know this because you just wrote a best-selling book on the topic, is a leader that can be intentionally disruptive. What does it mean to be intentionally disruptive, and why is it important?
Disruption can make you feel uncomfortable. It likely makes most people feel uncomfortable. And one of the reasons that, ultimately, Jeff, I wound up writing this book to talk about my own life experiences is that I started looking back uh, to even the early parts of my life and began to realize, I don't think it was really a conscious decision, that I really, Jeff, had never been a person to just sort of let the disruptions of my life just sort of affect my life and sit back and kind of take it. I'd always been somebody who, as I came to realize, had used this sort of internal strategy of my own, ultimately that came to be called intentional disruption, to sort of attack external forces that were against me, go on offense when I could, and in some ways start to disrupt the disruptors. And ultimately, that's how I dealt with the uncomfortability of being a CEO in these difficult positions. And that's how I've really tried to navigate my life.
So, I mean, were you born that way, or did you learn how to become a disruptor over time? And if so, because it sounds easy to say, hey, you're going to be hit with a barrage of disruptions that are going to make you feel uncomfortable, that are going to produce anxiety. So instead of just sitting back and being a punching bag, you need to take the fight to them and be a disruptor yourself. But that's easier said than done. I mean, how does someone that really believes in your philosophy become a disruptor themselves?
Well, I think that there's a series of internal work that each of us as leaders have to really think about. And there are hard skills around leadership and around making tough decisions. And then there are soft skills, I think, around things like empathy and transparency and being vulnerable. And it's a combination of those things that as you develop your career, trying to hone in and focus on the things that really help you move the dial are ultimately the kind of skills that you need, I think, to be successful in a disruptive environment.
So you said something to me that sounds counterintuitive. You said that soft skills like empathy and vulnerability and self-awareness are important part of being a disruptive leader. To me, it sounds like disruption and vulnerability are at odds with each other. Can you describe what you mean and just tell me why empathy and vulnerability are important?
Well, I think all of us come with our own set of angst and fears and worries about how we're perceived, about how we're doing our job, about what does it take to ultimately be successful. And Jeff, you and I have talked about a lot of these over a period of time, and I'll rattle off a few of them that I think might be interesting for the listener to sort of self-reflect on. I think the first is we all face this sort of uncertainty about this fear of looking stupid, of not being good enough, of this old philosophy of fake it till you make it really doesn't work. I mean, I think that we all have to sort of self-reflect on the fact that we're not perfect. Sometimes you do make the wrong decision, but getting past this fear of looking stupid is something that I think all of us sort of need to do. I
Have
think
you ever, I mean, Ben, have you ever felt that way yourself as, a big, powerful, renowned healthcare CEO? Have you ever had that fear of looking stupid?
I would say there was almost never a time when I was given a new job, a new opportunity. And, as I climbed the corporate ladder and moved to lots of different cities and took on lots of new jobs with lots of new responsibility, that when I walked into the office the first day on that new job, I didn't look around the room and think, can't believe they hired me for this job. How could they have possibly done that? I don't really know what they could have seen in me, and I'm not really sure I know what to do about all this. You have to work your way through that, focusing on the things that have gotten you to where you are to that day. And yes, certainly many different examples of things that I went through in my my CEO career, certainly at Kindred, where I was worried about looking stupid, where ultimately sometimes I was made to look stupid because I made the wrong decision. But it's how you react, pick yourself up off the mat, get back to doing the things that are part of your core. I tell this to people all the time, Jeff. Life is not a series of successes in a straight line that leads to, ultimately getting to the top of the pyramid. Life is a series of successes and setbacks, failures and achievements, and it's who can get up off the mat and move themselves forward. I think that really ultimately succeeds in the world.
That's incredibly well said. And just in the heat of the moment, so suppose there is a highly introverted person that's watching you speak right now, and they feel, they're stepping into a new position. They take a chance, but they kind of feel like they look stupid. And there's this moment between that feeling and then how they react. I mean, do you have any advice just to kind of settle that person down and to give him or her hope to move forward, even though they feel those really uncomfortable feelings?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that it's okay to have those feelings. It's perfectly natural. Most people do. It's also okay, as you and I just talked earlier, about showing a little bit of that vulnerability to your teammates. I don't think that we live in a day and age where you have to be, sort of the general, leading the charge every day with bullets flying by your ear and not showing any fear. It's okay to be able to tell your teammates, look, this is what we're going through. This is what I'm going through. This is how I'm feeling about it. This is what we're trying to accomplish. I find that empowering your team around your own vulnerabilities and around your own transparency of the issues that you're dealing with in many ways makes you a better leader, and in many ways rallies your team around you so that they feel more a part of the solution and of trying to get to the finish line, if you will, successfully, than they do just watching you lead in sort of a fake way.
And I keep it's so interesting to hear you say that again, because I see you as this powerful, CEO that's received all these awards and has a continuous string of successes. But you really honestly have no problem being vulnerable and saying, I don't know, or sharing that vulnerability with your team and not thinking even for a second, well, gosh, they're going to think I'm weak or not a good leader.
No, I mean, I would say 100%. I never felt that concern. In fact, I gained strength from that vulnerability. I always enjoyed talking to my team about the things I knew and the things I didn't know. Now, I always was very optimistic about the fact that we were going to figure it out and we were going to be successful. I never doubted that we were going to get to the finish line. But it is connecting on those dots of how to get from here to there that, being open to being vulnerable, makes a lot of sense. I'll give you one example, Jeff, that maybe of some interest. We often used a tool at Kindred. I'm sure that many of your listeners have used, called predictive indexing, PI, which is when they go and take a bit of a psychological profile on your strengths and your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities, et cetera. I actually had my predictive index review, which goes, it's sort of a 360 review, people above you, people below you, people that you work with. I actually had it printed out and handed out to every one of my leadership team members so that they could see, this is what works well for me, this doesn't work well for me. And there were some things on that made me pretty vulnerable, quite frankly, at times. But I found that it made me a stronger leader in the end when I was sharing that kind of information with my team.
Yeah, because most CEOs or most anyone that I know that gets that kind of a predictive index psychometric assessment results back, keep it very close to the vest. You're saying you actually shared that whole thing with your whole team.
That's right. And my
And
board.
and then and your board. So then you talked about, getting back and bouncing back from failures, which is going to be inevitable, especially in such a fast moving, unpredictable world. Obviously you can't lay on the mat the whole time or you're done. But how does someone go through the process of getting up off the mat and bouncing back and learning from that, even though they've just experienced what probably was a pretty humiliating failure?
Well, you have to have multiple different support mechanisms around you, and I'll get to that in a second. But the first thing that you have to really recognize is this idea that you just cannot have a fear of making tough decisions, even sometimes when they work and even sometimes when they don't. Oftentimes I think leaders forget that sometimes the idea of not making a tough decision is actually making a decision. And that, that can lead to its own set of problems. A disruptor, a leader, is somebody who, quite frankly, goes on offense, and the opposite of that are procrastinators who just aren't willing to face the reality that sometimes tough decisions have to be made. So the first thing is, I think, to recognize and to make sure that you're being willing to make those tough decisions. The second thing is, look, I think for all CEOs, the job can feel quite lonely. For leaders that are moving up in an organization, sometimes the job can feel quite lonely, wondering who you can talk to, who you can go to for advice. And so one of the things that I'm a huge proponent of, Jeff, is building a really strong support system around you. Hopefully you have that in your partner or your spouse or somebody that you can talk to when you go home, where you can talk out loud about issues that are facing you during the day. If you don't have that, I've worked with leadership coaches my whole life, including you, Jeff, and have had really great instinctive open dialogue about some of the things that I was dealing with. I've had different forums of business leaders who I've come to trust, groups like YPO and others, where you could get in a room and really talk about the issues that you have. It is hard to know who to trust and who you can go to, but if you can develop that core set of a team around you that you can take things from being just totally internal to being able to talk about them. I have found that as you're dealing with these kinds of disruptions, that's really the key ingredient towards keeping your head together on making smart decisions.
So if I just use one of those examples, YPO, or the Young Presidents Organization, which is an organization of very talented, young, up and coming, CEOs across the country. So if you walk into a room of people that you don't know yet, and you say you don't want to be naive, but at the same time, you don't want to keep all of these feelings bottled up inside either. So what is the process? I mean, how does someone get comfortable sharing some of these anxieties or fears or concerns with a group of people that they really don't yet know?
Well, it's a big leap of faith, let's say that. And I would tell you that for many of us, we're probably start the idea of being very cynical to opening up to ideas, to confidential information, to things that really nobody else should know. And so to begin the idea of sharing that is a bit of a leap of faith. I will tell you that for myself, I sort of rejected the idea for about a half a decade. I just wouldn't do it. I didn't feel comfortable sharing that kind of information. What really happens, I think, is
Why didn't you feel comfortable? Were you just cynical, or you didn't trust them yet?
I've always been somebody that's held things very close to the vest. I've always been somebody who keeps things very confidential. I don't like talking about things out of school. I think that, the ability to trust somebody with things that are important to you is not something that you just get over a minute or a week or a month. It takes time to develop those relationships. But, what I was going to say is, Jeff, that sometimes desperation turns into perspiration, and you have to find new ways to attack the problems that you have. And I was dealing, certainly as the CEO at Kindred, with so many different external things and internal things that were bothering me, that I just needed some sort of a support network. And I took a little bit of a leap of faith after a number of years of developing relationships, by the way, with a very small group. So in YPO specifically, you get into something called a forum, which is where you're in a group of, somewhere between 6 and 8 people, and you develop a relationship over time. And you essentially sign an oath of confidentiality with that group, and that if somebody breaks that trust, that they'll be out of the group for forever. And over the series of the last 10 years, I've been fortunate to have a group in which I've been able to share a lot of those things, and at least to my knowledge, nobody's ever broken confidentiality yet.
So it's really never come back to bite you at all. I mean, and you mentioned a second ago about some of the exogenous and internal factors and disruptions that were coming your way when you were a CEO. Can you maybe just do a brief deep dive into one or two of those things, maybe when you're about to go private, or just with some of the regulation that almost put you guys out of business, and how you dealt with, how it made you feel, and then how you dealt with the group and how you shared that with your YPO colleagues?
Sure, Jeff. Well, I had a series at Kindred of almost never ending life or death sort of bet the company kind of decisions, which really no CEO should have to be in that position. The position we were in was one because our balance sheet was turned upside down and we were heavily indebted, and the regulatory environment was very difficult, and our stock price was trading at a level that our shareholders weren't happy about. Basically, all of the external things that as a public company CEO you can have happen, that are negative, I sort of felt the burden of.
And by the way, to our viewers and listeners, I've dealt with hundreds of CEOs over the past 1 or 2 decades, and I know that this is true. And honestly, I still don't know how you've done it. So I just want to reassure people that it is true.
Well, it is true, and I appreciate your comment. And if you look back on our history, you'll know that. But let me just take your listeners through a series of large topics that we went through, and then I'm happy to dive into any of those that Jeff, you think may be more interesting. But in my tenure as the CEO, we did the following. We did, I think, the only and largest hostile public takeover of another public company right as I was becoming CEO and into my first months as CEO. Thankfully, successfully, that took a year and was very, very difficult. It moved us into a business, home health in this case, that we felt desperately that we needed to be a part of, and we just couldn't wrestle the company from a couple of leaders at its company that didn't necessarily want to sell the company. So a hostile public takeover, which was very, very complicated. We followed that a year later with the largest leverage buyout, the largest LBO, where we took the company private in healthcare that year, where we went from being public to being private, and we did a multi-pronged transaction with both a strategic, many of your listeners may know Humana, the large insurance company, and a private equity firm called TPG, a large global private equity firm in San Francisco. So taking the company private was a massive disruption and very, very complicated. In the process, Jeff, of taking the company private, we wound up being faced with a hostile actor, in this case, one of our large shareholders, a hedge fund in New York called Brigade, who tried to injunct our deal. We wound up having to get into a full proxy fight to win the vote, to win the shareholder vote, to ultimately approve the deal. And that was another year of my life trying to figure out how to ultimately make that transaction work. We then ultimately succeeded at that and took the company private. We split the company into two. I remained behind to run the hospital side of our business. We had to completely re-engineer and reinvent both the way we were structured and strategically the way our business was going to run, and all the while walking straight into the teeth of the global pandemic that we all know that was COVID, where our hospitals were really on the front line of caring for some of the most sick and infirmed throughout the last couple of years of dealing with COVID. Moved through that, through a series of different regulatory changes and regulatory burdens, ultimately re-engineered and reinvented the company, and exited successfully after only about 3 years of being private, as we sold the company to Apollo Global, which is another obviously large private equity firm, and their subsidiary, LifePoint Hospitals in Nashville, which is when I exited, Jeff, the company back in December of 2021. So yeah, I mean, it was a series of a lot of activity on the M&A side, on transacting, on trying to stay one step ahead of those that were out to get us, whoever that was, banks, regulators, whatever it was. But also the most important thing, and I think this gets lost on a lot of people, when you are the CEO of a large healthcare organization like I was, all the M&A and all these transactions, which are complicated and interesting and difficult and fun at some level, they don't replace the need to run the day-to-day operation, remain connected to your team, provide great patient care, deliver with quality and compliance, and hit your operational metrics, which at the end of the day, Jeff, really are your only currency towards being successful, which is how did you perform? So we had to do all of that
and keep the culture and keep the culture alive, right? And make sure that people are positive during all this turmoil.
And keep the culture alive. That's right. Very, very important.
And so it's overwhelming. I mean, it's absolutely overwhelming. There's nobody to turn to. You're at the top of the house. If you mess up, if you have one misstep on any of these things, you're done. The company's done. So then you go back to the support group. So if it's YPO or if it's your coach, what do you share? Because obviously some of this is confidential, but the feelings and, being able to share it with a broader group, how does that help you and how does that help them?
I'll use an example that I talk about in the book, and I actually quote it, and I remind myself of it warmly. And my good friend Jim Breier, who runs the Human Performance Institute down in Orlando, and I think he's at some point been the personal head coach to I think 25 number one tennis, golf, and professional athletes in the world, including Tiger Woods in his prime and others. And Jim was kind enough to take me in for a year, and I was going through I think the LBO at the time, and I remember calling him one night, and I remember just being so completely, not just stressed, but overwhelmed by, the events that were overtaking my life. And I remember saying, Jim, I'm dying. I mean, I'm dying here. I mean, I'm not going to make it through this. I think at one point I really thought that I was. And I remember him taking a step back and asking me a couple of interesting questions. He said, "Well, let me ask you a few questions." He said, I heard you bought a new house, a couple of months ago. How did that make you feel?" And I said, "Well, oh, it's a nice house. I don't know." He said, "And you got this new job title, and a new car, and some, people are calling you Mr. Breier now, and whatever it is. How does that make you feel?" And I said, I don't know." He goes, "It's not the things that you're achieving. It's certainly not the material things you're getting. This is all about the journey that you are on and the experiences that you are having." And he made a comment, and I'll never forget it. When I told him that I was dying, he said, "You're not dying, man. You're living." He goes, "This is what living is all about. It's going through these experiences. That's what the life that you're living really is. And you'll win some, and you'll lose some, and you'll fail, and you'll succeed. But in the end, you'll have lots more of these challenges along the way. It's all about, it sounds cliche, but it's all about this journey that you're on. You're living, you're living." I remember him saying that a lot.
I love it. And if you could turn the tables and you're the coach now, and certainly if you could do that as a CEO, someone that's younger and is just starting their career, maybe they haven't even started their career, they can take the same chances and live. I mean, what advice would you have to them as they begin to try to develop the leadership skills and the disruption skills that they need? What would you tell them?
Well, the first things are sort of obvious, but I think sometimes it's a little lost on youth. First of all, don't be afraid to try new things. Just because you think something has sort of is in a pretty box with a bow on it. This is what my career path is supposed to be, or these are the experiences I'm supposed to happen. That's not always the case towards what's going to provide you with the most growth. So don't be afraid to get out of your comfort zone and try different things. Number one. Number two, I use this sort of metaphor, get some dirt under your fingernails, Jeff. I mean, go do the dirty work. You don't have to, be the CEO overnight, where you're not, really getting into the nuts and the bolts of whatever business or whatever it is that you're trying to do really work. I have often found that the most power that I gained in terms of my ability to relate and deal with people within my organization is because there wasn't really a job that I hadn't done at some point in my career. There wasn't any of our businesses that I hadn't run at some point in my career. And it's those experiences that I think are the great equalizer in life, Jeff, where having that experience and really knowing how a business works really means a lot to your ultimate success. And the last thing I'll say is a little bit back to what we talk about, which is you've really got to be focused on these core fears that all of us have in terms of our own growth. And I talked about, the one about, a fear of looking stupid, but, a fear of failure, a fear of being vulnerable, a fear of, keeping your mental health strong, a fear of acting alone. I mean, all those kinds of things. I think young folks have to really be self-reflective on what is it that's bothering them, what is it that's holding them back and affecting them, and how do they push through some of those barriers. Ultimately, Jeff, I think that's what's going to lead to somebody who is just starting out in their professional life being most successful.
And I know that you were recently invited to some really top-notch universities across the country: Harvard, Brown, Vanderbilt, Babson, and many others. And I know that they asked questions about this, and they wanted you to give some advice about your book. Was the dialogue good? I mean, were they willing to, when you told them that, hey, listen, even as a CEO, I need to embrace my fear of failure or some of the concerns and anxieties that I have, how did they feel? I mean, did they feel sort of like Superman or invulnerable, or did they feel like they couldn't fail, or was it a lively dialogue that you had with the students?
Every one of the schools we've been at has been an incredibly lively dialogue. I probably got more out of it than they got out of me, because I was able to interact with some really smart young folks who, when you're in the middle of your undergraduate studies, when you're just starting out your graduate degree, you've got a lot of your life in front of you. You've got a lot of uncertainty. Quite frankly, Jeff, there are a lot of disruptions that all of those students are feeling and thinking about every day. And so I think the book and the commentary about my life really resonated strongly with these groups that I've had the wonderful experience to meet with. I found them to be very direct in terms of asking very direct questions. I found them, quite frankly, Jeff, to be vulnerable in their own way. They were not afraid to ask a stupid question. Quite frankly, I don't think many of them did. but I know that they probably thought they might be when they were asking. I thought that they really wanted to understand getting into my head about some of my decision-making process, not just about how I handled a certain aspect of business, but how I thought about my career, how I thought about taking chances, how I thought about risk. And I just found the dialogue to be fantastic. I think that this generation coming up, while all new generations do things in their own particular way, and maybe there's a little bit more of an entrepreneurial bent to these folks. I think kids likely are not going to go work for one company for the next 30 years. I think we've sort of all established that. I think this idea about hearing about my book, Intentional Disruption, and thinking about the leadership and the life lessons that I tried to teach seems like it resonated really well. And it was incredibly empowering for me to go talk to all those kids.
That's so amazing. And I've heard a lot of feedback from those, and I was with you on a couple, so I know that that's all true. Good news is last question. Bad news, it's a two-part question. Um, now that you've spent time with that, up and coming generation at these schools, should they be looking for companies or organizations of any shape and size that actually help them, reach their full potential or help them become disruptive? And the second part, if you're giving advice to other CEOs of companies, would you recommend that they try to create the kind of culture that develops and nurtures intentionally disruptive leaders?
Well, I would argue that for somebody looking for where they're going to start their profession, it's almost a have to have, Jeff. You've got to go work for an organization that is not going to tell you all the answers. It's not going to draw you a roadmap to success. I mean, no companies out there really do that. But if you are in a place where you are not feeling professionally supported and developed, and where you're not really being given opportunities to go get outside of your comfort zone and learn, it's probably not the right place for you.
And that does vary a lot, because I've just seen it over 2 decades that some companies could care less about that, and other companies like Kindred are great at it, and then all of these companies in between. So there really is a difference, right?
There's no question there's a difference. I think I'm right when I would argue that in 2022 things are evolving pretty quickly. I think as there is this huge war on for talent and for retention, and not the least of which just recruiting people in the first place. I think more and more companies, both big and small, are recognizing that they have to start to develop some infrastructure around how we bring people into an organization and how we train that up. And that leads directly, Jeff, to your second question about large organizations. Look, at Kindred, I don't know that we were unique. Maybe we were a little bit ahead of the game. We developed so many different programs to try and not only recruit new talent into our organization, in many ways, people who might not have originally thought that going in, working in the healthcare field or working at Kindred or working at a company that was headquartered in Louisville, Kentucky might have been for them. And then secondarily, once we got them into the organization, how did we professionally develop them, to move them along? So we had created this wonderful program called our Executive Fellowship Program, where we were recruiting not just out of the best 10 schools in the country, but out of the top 100 schools in the country, geographically, just trying to find great kids that met and fit what we were trying to do, and overlay that with this really sophisticated program to onboard them really in the first 2 years of their career. We onboarded them and tracked them and stayed with them until they were ready to launch into our organization. And then having a Rising Stars program, having programs where we were identifying who could be the next officers of our company, who could be the next CEO, who could be the next chief nursing officer, the next leader, the next whatever. We spent millions of dollars and a lot of time and effort on that. But I think that the net result, Jeff, is that when you look at our executive ranks at the time that I left, let's say we had 40 to 50 officers of the company. I venture to guess at least 2/3 of those were internal hires that grew within our organization and ultimately became leaders. And I'm talking about all the way up to the CEO and the CFO and the CHRO and lots of other people in between. So it's critical, and I hope more companies will do this in the future. I think they will.
And even though I'm just going back to what you said earlier, that at the end of the day, it's hitting your operating targets and being a profitable company, it's still worth spending millions of dollars on what some would argue are soft skills and leadership skills. I mean, how do you reconcile the two?
Very simply, you can't hit your operating goals and you cannot meet your strategic needs if you don't have a team that is bringing you there to accomplish those goals. And you can't bring your team there without giving them those softer skills and without giving them that leadership development. And I would argue there's not an amount of money in the world. I mean, you invest in technology, systems, and processes, you certainly should be developing and investing in people. I never regret a single dollar that we spent in that category.
Ben Breier, thank you very much. I said it at the beginning of the conversation. I'll say it again. I think you're not only one of the best CEOs in healthcare, but one of the best CEOs in general across all industries in the country. Thank you so much for your time today.
Jeff, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.